If you've been in a Dynasty startup fantasy football draft recently, you have noticed there is a frenzy to roster young, unproven players. Dynasty owners shove each other out of the way to use high draft picks on players that are more of a projection rather than bankable assets. Even experienced Dynasty players generally have this major leak in their game. The more Dynasty leagues you join, the more you observe this obsession with young players. Many Dynasty players make the error of loading up their rosters with hot breakout candidates who have not produced consistently in the NFL. In theory, yes, you want a roster full of young players who have a longer shelf life of fantasy relevance. Dynasty players, myself included, are rejecting aging players to an unhealthy extreme. As soon as a player hits 28 years old, we want to trade them off our roster, expecting to recoup full value as if they were still 24 years old. There is a clinical term for this. It's called sexy roster syndrome, SRS. Dynasty players get a feeling of euphoria from looking at their rosters filled with players touted as the next big thing. The sobering moment for those afflicted with SRS is when the redraft rankings come out and that hot prospect is seen for what they are: an unproven player with legitimate questions whose ADP is much lower in redraft than it is in Dynasty. For example, Drake London, the rookie wide receiver on the Atlanta Falcons, is a fringe first-round pick in our RotoWire Dynasty magazine. In redraft leagues, London typically goes in the 6th or 7th, maybe even the 8th round. He can certainly be one of the premier receivers in the NFL for the next half decade, but building your Dynasty team around a projection is suboptimal. There are multiple paths to winning a Dynasty Fantasy Football Championship. Anyone who tells you they have it figured out should be ignored. Dynasty Fantasy Football is an ever-evolving game. The main difference between the two games, Redraft and Dynasty, is the valuing of players. There is no better example of this in 2022 than Buccaneers wide receiver Mike Evans, who will be 29 years old when the season starts in 2022. Evans has one of the largest chasms between his Dynasty ADP and his redraft ADP. Evans' age is driving his market value too low in Dynasty startup drafts. Evans is a prime example of Dynasty players not valuing winning in the short term. Evans is a near lock for 1,000 yards and double-digit touchdowns in 2022. That large gap in ADP is how sharp Dynasty players can profit. The best fantasy football forecasters do an average job at predicting what will happen in the season in front of us. How can we expect to predict what will happen 3 seasons from now? A player like Evans, who has produced at an elite level for nearly a decade, is as safe as a bet as we can make. There is time to be wary of Hall of Fame fantasy players like Julio Jones, AJ Green, T.Y. Hilton. Dynasty players just need to let the redraft market do all of the work for them. Those 3 players have redraft ADPs outside of the top 60 wide receivers. The aging players who have displayed a clear drop-off are the ones to be ignored. Aging players who are still among the league leaders in the previous year's ranks and are projected to produce well in the upcoming season, those are a clear buy in Dynasty. While many Dynasty players are in hot pursuit of unproven youth and suffer from sexy roster syndrome, we can exploit our edge with the aging veterans.
Alan Seslowsky